This is Score the Podcast. I'm Kenny Holmes. That's Matt Schrader. We have a special episode for you today. We continue.
Bonus episode.
Yeah. This composer has been working on one of the most popular shows on cable, which you don't hear a lot these days, saying that there's a super popular show on cable, unless it's live sports. Not a lot of analog stuff really hitting. But he's the composer of Dark Side of the Ring, which is on their 5th season, and also their latest 4-part docuseries, Who Killed WCW. Andrew Gordon McPherson is joining us on the show from Canada. The story of this series is interesting, and I was trying to explain this to Matt a little bit because
in all fairness, I'm not really a pro wrestling fan. I know a little bit just because it's in the culture. It's you do cross it, but in terms of the kind of narratives, it's such a rich, soapy soap opera is the way that you kind of described some of it. But all of these kind of narratives, and it becomes this giant universe. It's kind of like superheroes where there are just roles and kind of different archetypes and different characters and villains and heroes and people flipping and all this kind of craziness that happens.
It's classic storytelling.
Yes,
for sure.
And sometimes over years and years and years. But this series is really interesting because it's actually kind of consolidating a lot of those storylines and some of the behind the scenes stuff that people weren't aware of, and how these were crafted. All of these kind of rich, narrative elements that play out through really like performance art in a way. So it's an interesting thing to score something like that, because it is a story still with a lot of elements to it, but it's also reality.
Well, you're telling the story of people playing characters.
Yeah.
So think if you were doing a docuseries on, Broadway, but during a show's Broadway run, some tragedies happened in real life, and you're telling these stories using these people who play characters, but in the story you're telling, they're not playing their character anymore. And a lot of this stuff wasn't ever, I mean, these things happened 30, 40 years ago, but up until the last 5 or 6 years, it became okay to pull the curtain back and review. I mean, no one thought wrestling was real past like 1980, but the characters coming out and talking as themselves, Hulk Hogan saying my name is Terry was not like a normal thing back then. So these stories they're Dark Side of the Ring is not just a clever name. Some of these stories are they're tragedies, or there's a murder mystery or something like that. A lot of true crime probably inspired some of this as well. But Andrew's been scoring this show from the beginning. And then they have this 4-part docuseries called Who Killed WCW, which WCW was a major wrestling promotion in the 90s that competed with the king of everything, which is WWE. But they had a major downfall after hitting a peak, and this explores why that happened. And it's fascinating because they have interviews with, Ted Turner's son and a lot of executives from Time Warner and these kind of background people that back then you just never even heard about. But everyone's kind of pointing the finger at what happened, and it's kind of a big moment in television history, and it explores that part of it as well, along with what the characters were doing and why they were upset about story.
And that whole series produced by The Rock too, so it's big budget. There's a lot of attention put into it, a lot of time and care put into it. The music is obviously really cool, which brings us back to this interview. And I know we had a few kind of little technical hiccups just now, so I think we'll review it in editing and see if all of those if it's smooth sailing on all of those. But just as a heads up to listeners, there may be a few little
bit of internet
there.
lag.
But yeah, really fun conversation.
So let's get to it. Here's our chat with Dark Side of the Ring and Who Killed WCW composer Andrew Gordon McPherson. All right, he's an ASCAP Screen Music Award winner and composer of some of Vice's most watched shows, including 5 seasons of Dark Side of the Ring and the newest 4-part docuseries, Who Killed WCW. Please welcome Andrew Gordon McPherson to the show. What's up, Andrew?
What's up, guys? Thanks for the awesome intro.
Of course. So you go by Ango also, or is that your solo artist? How do you distinguish Ango versus Andrew Gordon McPherson?
I released some records for a few years under the name Ango, which is just short for Andrew Gordon. It's like the hip DJ version of Andrew Gordon, which is not a super exciting name. So
Uh
Uh-oh. We got a frozen screen. Okay, all right. I think we're back.
So let's take it back. You are scoring these incredible Vice series, which, by the way, it's kind of cool to see analog TV announcing things like the most watched. I mean, you don't hear that a lot anymore. Most of the popular shows are streaming, but Vice has really hit a home run with these docu series on pro wrestling, and I'm curious how you connected with Vice, how you got on board with the show, and what your initial interest was in doing this. Were you a wrestling fan?
yeah, I mean, well, going way back, in like I grew up in Truro, Nova Scotia, on the east coast of Canada, which is basically like only known for the underwear factory and the Trailer Park Boys. Um, and got really into playing guitar and music production, and I was super into comic books and wrestling as kids are in the 90s, and decided I wanted to go to film school. And I went to the Nova Scotia Community College Screen Arts program, where I met Jason Eisner, who is the co-creator of Dark Side of the Ring and Tales from the Territories, and who killed
Oh, cool.
WCW. Um, Jason was a year above me in school. But once a week I had a class with him, and we stayed in touch a little bit. But then I moved to Montreal, and then eventually to Toronto. And I was working actually as a picture editor for a long time. And around 2000 or 2015, I guess, he put a message on Facebook that he was looking for an assistant editor for a film that he was going to be editing in Toronto. That film was Jay Baruchel's Goon 2, Last of the Enforcers, which I didn't know at the time, but I messaged him. I was like, hey, man, I've been living in Toronto for a while. I've been working at a bunch of post houses. Let me know more about the project. I can find the perfect person for you. And he said, it's Goon 2 with Jay Baruchel. And I was like, shit, I want to do that. And I quit my job as a picture editor at a post house to be assistant picture editor to Jason Eisner on Jay Baruchel's first film. Which the process of editing that took a while, like eight to 10 months, I think. And in that time, Jason was developing Dark Side of the Ring, as well as a bunch of other things. And me and Jason and Jay would just hang out in the basement 24/7. Well, not 24/7. Let's say 12/5.
12 5, yeah.
About 12/5, and we were just like sharing music with each other, making sequences together, watching movie references, watching TV, all this stuff, and we just really got on the same page. And I had a recording studio here in Toronto then, and on the weekends we would hang out and watch movies, play video games, whatever. And I was working on records and stuff for my own enjoyment musically while paying the bills as a picture editor. And he said he was looking for some music for this pitch that he was doing about wrestling, but it was going to be like a prestige doc series, like an Errol Morris style doc on pro wrestling. And they wanted some music that was somewhere between sort of what Philip Glass had done with Errol Morris and like Tangerine Dream and, Mike, sort of the scores of like Michael Mann and whatever. And I just mocked a few things up for him, and he put it in these little pitch videos that were literally him talking to camera as a wrestler, intercut with his action figures, lit like the reenactments are in Dark Side, so like silhouette and smoke and whatever. And yeah, then they were asked to do a pilot, which was the Bruiser Brody episode, and it was turned out amazing. And but they kind of sat on it for a long time. I don't think Vice really knew what to do with it. They just, this is a cool story, but and then in the middle of one of their seasons, a show went down. I think one of the hosts of a certain show they had got sick or something, and they were like, "It's not coming back, so we need a new show." We have this pilot, and they like greenlit 6 episodes of Dark Side, and I think they greenlit it in May, and it had to be on TV in September. And so it was just a mad dash to make those, and me and Jason and Evan and just like spent a ton of time just like making every frame of those first 6 perfect, or as close to perfect as we could.
Do I
And
understand
then
you correctly? But I'm interrupting a little bit. But you started off as a TV editor. Is this correct that you were working on stuff for Food Network and HGTV?
yeah, yeah, it's many different cooking shows, different real estate flipper shows, National Geographic documentaries about caves, uh, and some sitcoms like Canadian broadcasting,
Sure.
uh, comedies and stuff, but a lot of lifestyle stuff, and then over to the features with Jason and Jay.
Very
There's
cool.
not a lot of composers that we've talked to. The only one that I can think of is John Ottman, who
Yeah.
is a picture editor turned composer. I don't know. I don't remember what came first, but what first off, was that a weird transition for you? I mean, obviously you had the skills to do it, but that wasn't the path you were on. And also, how does that help you as a composer having those editing skills?
Yeah, so it's funny because over my whole journey, took a long time. Even though it seems kind of obvious now, it never occurred to me that I could potentially be a film or TV composer. I When I first was the first movie I saw in the theater was Batman '89, and my impression of what a legit film composer was is John Williams and Danny Elfman basically, and I took some music education, but I had a really hard time. I don't know what it was, but I had a really hard time with piano lessons and all these things. But I loved music, and I loved art, and I just never thought I could really be a professional musician. That would always be kind of my hobby. But I got super into music production, and then I got super into independent film. Like I remember seeing Aronofsky's Pi, or in high school. This is like 2000 or something, for the first time, and being like the spirit of DIY that
Hmm.
you get from that film was just like, I want to do that. I just want to make stuff like that. I love like Clint Mansell. I love all his music, but it was like I feel like I can almost kind of do this. You know what I mean, with making sort of beats on the computer and putting it on a 4 track and playing guitar over like all this stuff. I can almost kind of do this, and I could never get a 35 millimeter camera in those days, but I could probably get a 16 mil Bolex and like put these beats on it, and that seems like a cool thing to do.
Yeah.
So I've been since 1996 making music productions of various, whether it's recording other people or making my own things. And then I always thought like I would go to film school and I would become an assistant director or an editor or something, and that's what I would do to pay the bills. And I would like play in scrappy bands and make electronic music for fun on the side. But the thing that happens is when you have uh, any sort of skills in the audio department at film school, then you just end up being the sound guy for everyone's, because most people hate working in sound. Um, and so I went to film school in Nova Scotia for a couple of years. That's where I met Jason, and I did a lot of everything there. And then I went to a post grad thing here in Ontario at Sheridan College, which is really known as an animation school more than filmmaking school. And I specialized in directing and audio post production. But the only work that I was able to get out of school was, first in the camera department on like early these P2 card
Oh yeah.
shows, so dumping P2 cards, which was like kind of like assistant editing, and I was playing in bands at night and DJing and stuff like that. And then that kind of went. I worked at a company called Deluxe. I don't know if you ever go to YouTube and you watch like a clip from a famous movie. Like, I'm one of the guys that clipped a lot of those clips for this movie clips. What is now movieclips.com, I'm sure was all done by Deluxe and me and a bunch of wannabe comedians like trying to make pun titles for these like clips from The Dark Knight and stuff. And then I got a job as a post assistant, and then an assistant editor, and then I edited trailers, and then I had blah blah blah, all that stuff. So all that time, in my brain there was just this split of like music is what I do for fun, and I can make my own music anytime. No one needs to tell me what to do, and I pay my bills by being a filmmaker, and aspiring to kind of do both when I can on my own material at some point. And then around 2010, I got invited to this thing called Red Bull Music Academy, which it's not around anymore. But the elevator pitch of Red Bull Music Academy was people from all over the world submit this it's like an essay basically, but it's a big application form. But their tastes in music and their ideas about music, and then the people from the Red Bull Music Academy would select 2 classes of 30, and they would fly you to a host city, and there'd be like 12 fully staffed recording studios that you could use 24/7, and
Wow.
2 lectures a day that you were mandatory. You had to go to the lectures, but then the rest of the time you could either go to the studios or you could go to the events in the host city that were usually shows, and sometimes the participants would play on the shows. I opened for MF Doom at the Roundhouse in London in the side room, which was really crazy. But like some of the people that I got to talk to, like Russ Elevado, who mixed D'Angelo, like Flying Lotus, Busy P, who managed Daft Punk, Dr. Peter Zinoviev, who started EMS synthesizer. So it was like I just expanded what I love about music, and what I thought was this sort of sabbatical from my world as a filmmaker turned into like I got signed to a label in the UK, and I started touring and working with all these artists and doing production and being in Pitchfork and doing top line. And so for like 4 or 5 years music became the 100% focus and was paying my bills, not as a composer, just in the sort of records and independent music spectrum.
Yeah.
And then the sort of bottom all fell out of it. I kind of stopped focusing on releasing music under the name Ango in to do top line for there was some major label interest in my catalog and for me to do top line in production. And and then my management kind of like disappeared, and the label kind of fell out of the way, and I found myself back to editing. And then within 2 years of that, that's when the sort of like call came from Jason about doing this other thing. And so
Well, with Dark Side, it's an ambitious thing because, and for those who aren't like wrestling fans, just if I can explain kind of the background of what has happened, there was in the 80s, Hulk Hogan was a big thing, and that was kind of the only connection to pop culture. Hulk Hogan and maybe Andre the Giant. They were, in movies, Princess Bride, and some of these movies and stuff. Then there was a period where it was kind of just for the fans. But in the late 90s, which is kind of what you are basically covering this whole period in Who Killed WCW, but there was a massive pop culture connection where it wasn't just about wrestling. The wrestlers were on TV. They were on The Tonight Show. They were being put in The Simpsons. I mean, they were connected in everything. And it totally blew up. But during all of this time, there wasn't, it was totally blasphemous to discuss wrestling as a business. Like, no one talked out of character. Nobody, The Undertaker wouldn't go on an interview and say, oh man, I'm really good friends with Stone Cold Steve Austin. Like, they would never do that. And nowadays that blasphemy is gone and everyone has kind of opened the floodgates. But you guys were kind of at the forefront of telling these stories and opening these doors. That wasn't really a thing 4 or 5 years ago until podcasts started coming out and things like that. So doing these sort of pulling the curtain back documentaries, I imagine there was major pushback by the wrestling organizations. I mean, how challenging was it to tackle something like this and get these guys on camera? Because it's almost like a magician revealing their secrets. Like you just don't, at that time, you just didn't do that.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's hard for me to speak too much about the sort of resistance that they've gotten at a production level. I know anecdotally a few things, I guess, but through the '90s, I mean, I think Vince McMahon was the first one to sort of like show everything behind the curtain because of a legal situation where, there was something with the venues where they would have had to have tax if it was a combat sport, but if it was a entertainment event, that he recoined. I think that's how he coined the term, or when they changed to World Wrestling Entertainment, and then I remember there was the NBC show that was like sort of revealing all the secrets, and there's been this trickle through the years of like the disintegration of kayfabe, I guess, and the years leading up to Dark Side of the Ring, every wrestler has got a podcast, and shoot interviews are like a huge genre of content on YouTube. And Jason and Evan's idea was like, for the show, the hook of the show is like, in the old days there was kayfabe. You had to protect the business. You had to live your character. But behind the scenes, the character would affect reality, and what was going on in reality would affect the character. And let's focus on that aspect of the business and the families and the people that you've never seen, and also let's shoot the shoot interviews, but let's get all the people involved, and they're all shooting, and we'll shoot it with a good camera and good music, and we'll do reenactments. And so it's kind of like bringing a cinematic production value to what was already kind of happening, I think, in sort of YouTube and podcast culture in a way. Now, I think when they go and show up to some of the wrestlers, they're still living their gimmicks in some ways, or they still feel like. I think the first time they interviewed Abdullah the Butcher was for the Bruiser Brody episode, and he's still trying to be Abdullah the Butcher in some ways to them. Like in one, they're at his house, and there's only so much of it of the sort of masquerade he can put on, I think. But by the time we did a full episode about Abdullah the Butcher, he was ready to take off the mask, and speak truthfully. So I think there's been, I think at the beginning of it there might have been a little bit more resistance, at least internally, to some of the wrestlers about how they speak on some of the things. But now, 5 seasons later, and after people have seen a lot of the episodes and seen sort of what we're trying to accomplish, and like people get it, I think there's a little bit less resistance now.
Yeah, you kind of opened the floodgates. And in terms of writing music, as a wrestling fan or somebody who's familiar, at least in a pop culture sense, a lot of the music themes that wrestlers, we've had Jim Johnston on the show talking about writing some of these famous tracks that.
Yeah, shout out, man.
Really...
I'm so happy you had him on. Like, I love that episode. I love that guy. It was so cool that you guys did that, and I'm so glad to see his name in the podcast list with Howard Shore and Danny Elfman and all of these guys.
Yeah, it was a treat.
Kudos to you, man.
Appreciate that. But in terms of the show, these are sort of unauthorized. You don't have the rights to play these themes when you're talking about these characters. So I'm curious, from your point of view, do you channel the energy of the themes when you're talking about certain characters, or when you're, showing a reenactment? How do you sort of bring people back to whatever era that you're talking about in the episodes?
Yeah, I mean, this comes up a lot because for some characters, the theme music is kind of like you can't separate the character from the theme music in a lot of ways. Like we did an Ultimate Warrior episode, his music is so iconic. We did a Bret Hart episode, the Montreal Screwjob, which is largely featured Bret Hart. We did Sandman episode this last season, whose entrance music was Enter Sandman by Metallica, which is probably the one we have the least leeway with as far as trying to access in any sort of way. But the stories are usually not about the wrestling characters. The music, I try and think that the music is of the world of the characters that they were playing, and I'm telling the story about who they were as men and women, and that can either mean that I'm trying to create music that is in stark contrast from what you know musically about them, but sometimes I can try and have a little wink and a nod to usually what Jim has created. So for instance, the Warrior episode, I tried to, like, because that music is so iconic to him, I tried to listen to Jim's theme and imagine this as the first hymn in the like barbarian hymn book that is of the warrior mythology. You know what I mean? And write some pieces that could fit in a collection with Jim's in some way. But then with the Grizzly Smith episode, Jake the Snake obviously is featured heavily in that episode. His theme song is probably my favorite of all of Jim's themes, but Jake very specifically in that episode separates himself, Aurelian Smith, from Jake the Snake, and he talks about Jake as if it's a whole other person. And that score is it's kind of like a domestic horror movie in a lot of ways. And so the sort of pounding, rolling synth kind of thing that you associate with Jake the Snake is not like totally appropriate for the story that we're telling. And so I try to do other things, like there's slide guitar that I thought was kind of like snaky or something, but also like falls into the palette of this Texas domestic horror film.
I wanted to ask you about instrumentation and maybe some of the kind of standout things that you went through, or maybe even some areas where you kind of fell in love with a kind of like unique approach that maybe wasn't obvious to begin with. But what do you kind of point to as some of those things that you stumbled into and you thought, oh man, that actually really, really works better than I thought it did?
Let's see. Well, so when we did the Von Erich story, our take on, or the way we told the Von Erich story, it's now been told by a major motion picture from sort of
if you're the Iron Claw is
the A24
is a film about the Von Erich family.
So good.
Yeah. So our Von Erich film, it's centered around Kevin, and Kevin Von Erich, where he is now in his life. He's basically the only surviving brother of five brothers. Man, there's so many of them. Who's living in this paradise in Hawaii, and the story is him kind of recounting the rise and fall and tragedy of his family. And so on one hand, it's this almost like spaghetti western story of the brothers from world-class championship wrestling, but I was trying to kind of evoke this tranquility that he is trying to maintain in Hawaii, and thinking about I was just throwing everything at the wall, and I ended up using these they're samples. I didn't have the real thing, but the crystal bachette and the like singing bowls and
Oh yeah,
a lot of these sort of water-based instruments. Cliff Martinez is the sort of master in contemporary cinema scores of that, but having that kind of ethereal Zen singing water and singing glass as what he's trying to maintain in Hawaii after everything he's been through, contrasting with this sort of neo spaghetti western 80s uh, epic story of world class championship wrestling and the brothers and the deaths and the all of that stuff. Um, it just uh, it really stuck to picture for me in trying to illustrate that idea.
It is a pretty crazy juxtaposition when you think about it, just intellectually. Like how are you going to make sounds like that work together?
Yeah, and I love that episode. You know it is such a crazy story and it's cool that some of these stories are sort of influencing like the A24 film and other things and
Totally. Yeah.
It
and bringing some form of like legitimacy to
Yeah.
when I say legitimacy I say there's like a perception of like when I say I mean uh Brad Siegel says it in WCW that it's like people consider wrestling lowbrow,
Hmm.
to this day, even though Dwayne the Rock Johnson is the biggest movie star in Hollywood, and it's all these ratings, and the curtain is down on kayfabe, and it still continues to be, you know, some people when you try and talk to about pro wrestling, they just roll their
Yeah.
eyes, and
Oh
then they
God.
see a
Yeah.
Dark Side of the Ring episode, and then but to their when you see Dark Side of the Ring episodes and you meet these people and these characters, like they're the most interesting, more interesting than any character you could write in some
Yeah.
cases, and so it's good to see some legitimacy coming to that, and also
yeah.
I, for Jason and Evan who tried for a long time before Dark Side to make scripted feature films, the telling of World Class Championship Wrestling, the telling of Gino Hernandez, the telling, and got nowhere. Just had studio execs rolling their eyes at them to see it kind of coming to fruition, in part from their fruits of their labor of like actually bringing these stories to a modern audience is like feels good. So that's really cool.
Well, when we talk to TV composers a lot, um, time is of the essence with these. Oftentimes if it's a composer director duo, they get a film sometimes a year before, sometimes not the case. But with TV, it seems like there's a lot more sped up timeline. But you're talking about researching and finding all these different instruments, and it's not just one palette for the whole season. How much time do you get, and how stressful is it for you to try and find a sound for each standalone episode?
Yeah, so with Jason and Evan from the jump, from episode one, once we knew it was a series, their dream uh, was every episode is its own genre of cinema, you know, and part of that plays into who the sort of characters are and what their gimmicks were, but also like their stories are vastly different. So like Dino Bravo is it's like a French mafia movie, and uh, you know Dr. D, he kind of gets betrayed by the WWE and becomes a bounty hunter, and like New Jack, it's like a G-funk horror film. It's like so there's all of this really amazing territory to mine for musical ideas from all of the characters and their gimmicks, but also their out of ring antics. And so we work in kind of a different way, I think, partially because of what Vice was comfortable with in the beginning, and we came up with a sort of methodology that has worked, that everyone has liked. And part of this comes from my trust of Jason as an editor, because I was Jason's assistant editor for a while, and I've seen him edit music. But in order to hit the deadlines of the first season, I, Vice was very, at that time, used to working with library music, and the idea of the extra whatever amount of time it was going to take to go to a composer made them nervous. And I kind of came up with this solution of like, give me the first cut of the film of each episode, and I'll write a custom library for each episode. Now, from episode to episode, like
Wow.
every episode, we have to kind of like we have to establish the WWE constantly. We have to establish Vince McMahon constantly. There's many episodes where it's like, if this is the only episode you've seen, we've got to gloss over who Vince McMahon is or who WWE is. So there's a certain amount of music over the season that gets reused. But then my sort of pitch to them to make the schedule work was, I know what the big moments are, and I know who the characters are. Let me write a bit of a sort of library for you for each episode. And then you'll have stuff that you can populate across the whole season, as well as really specific stuff for really specific moments. So we kind of have the best of both worlds. And they agreed to that. And, I agreed to do that because I knew that Jason was going to be the last editor on every episode at that time. And anyway, as we got renewed for multiple seasons, they kind of liked and wanted to keep working that way. And so I write about. Oh, the other thing I should say is Jason's personal style of filmmaking is wall-to-wall music, and all his films and everything is like he wants constant music. So the Bruiser Brody episode's 44 minutes. It's got 43 and a half minutes of original music.
It's amazing.
So my pitch to them was like, I'll write 20 to 30 minutes per episode of new music per episode. And, anything and basically that you guys handle the like music editing on your side as the cuts develop. So we're working in tandem. I still only get about a week per episode. So I'm writing 20 to 30 minutes of music from the first time I see it to delivering in about a week, sometimes 10 days, depending on if, the schedules of production and whatever. So it's very fast. Finding that genre or like what sort of like how I'm going to kick off. Sound of it is the hardest part. There are clues, and it doesn't always work or the first time, but I've come to embrace a concept that my high school creative writing teacher installed in my head in, I guess, the early 2000s, which was write it bad first, write badly. And so I write a whole episode as badly as I can in a day, pretty much. So I literally set a timer. I have like a 6-hour writing session, 6 to 8 hour writing session. I have a timer, 45 minutes per cue ish. And I just put the picture up, I put it down on piano, whatever time is left in my 45 minutes, I just start to try and produce it and arrange it, and I export it at the end of the 45 minutes. And the next day I wake up and I get my coffee and I listen back on my phone speaker, and I just have a big notepad and I make a note. At this time, code add a string pad. At this, bring this idea back here. And I usually have about 3 or 4 pages of notes, and then I sit down and I just pick away at those notes and until the day is done, and I export everything again. And then the next day I do the same thing. And by the time the sort of week runs out or my time runs out, they're usually pretty developed. And, I find it just really helps to not like take the pressure off myself of trying to write it perfectly the first time, and just getting enough notes down, because maybe the editor brain in me. I also find it that when I'm listening to something away from my sequencer and my instruments, I listen to it better and I understand what needs to happen better. So I can articulate that to myself and then execute it much faster than me sitting here at my sequencer and looping and improvising and whatever executive dysfunction I might have, get distracted by guitar pedals or whatever.
Totally. Well, you guys are crushing it. I encourage people to check these shows out, even if you're not a wrestling
quite your
fan,
jam,
if you're
give it a shot.
fan of The stories are incredible, and oftentimes you will recognize people just from, like I said, pop culture. There's some really great stories, and the latest one, Who Killed WCW, is a 4-part story. And personally, I found it interesting. I mean, yes, I was watching wrestling during that period, but from a business kind of background story, hearing about Ted Turner and Time Warner and the decisions they were making, and putting their nose up at wrestling, even though it was their most popular show, it's really cool to see that curtain pulled back and see how the inner workings of a huge TV business was working at that time too. So, Andrew Gordon McPherson, man, thanks so much for coming on the show, and keep crushing it too with Dark Side of the Ring, man. I hope you guys have plenty more seasons to come.
Thanks so much, and likewise to you and the podcast, because it is truly one of my favorite things to listen to when I'm driving and whatever. And you guys have had some really awesome guests, like shout out Jim Johnston, and I really appreciate, and I'm honored to come and chat with you.
Absolutely, man.
So
well, congrats, and yeah, looking forward to more, bro.